Progressive commentator Kyle Kulinski hasn't had a great year. He was rejected by Bernie Sanders to do an interview, had left the Young Turks after the Jimmy Dore incident, and apparently advocated for blackmail. And now he has released this tape, where he called for the US not to defend Taiwan in case of Chinese aggression, and was ratioed by what appears to be his own audience as a result. This was in response to Biden saying he would defend Taiwan, and here is my response.
And can you vow to protect Taiwan?
Yes and yes. That's why you hear people saying Biden wants to start a new Cold War with China. I don't want a Cold War with China. I just want to make China understand that we are not going to step back. We are not going to change any of our views.
So are you saying that the United States would come to Taiwan's defense if China attacked?
Yes, we have a commitment.
No, indeed we do not. So Jen Psaki came out the day after and basically walked that statement back in so many words. The U.S. policy approach towards Taiwan is something called strategic ambiguity. And the idea behind it is we sort of treat Taiwan as its own thing, its own independent nation of sorts, even though it's technically really not. So there's the one China policy, and that includes Taiwan. Now, of course, the sentiment in Taiwan much more leans on the side of we want to be our own thing, but the one China policy dictates that effectively they're not their own thing. And again, the United States approach is strategic ambiguity, so it's like we treat them as their own thing, we sort of trade with them as their own thing. I believe we even provide them with weapons that are quote-unquote defensive in nature, but there is no stated, like, oh, if China does something to try to reclaim it in a way, that we're going to come to their defense and we're going to fight on their behalf. And so when Biden says, well, that's we have a commitment, that's actually not true. So he seemingly doesn't know what the U.S. policy towards Taiwan is. And naturally, in Beijing, they heard this, and the Chinese brass are like, easy there, Tiger. Easy. Watch what you're saying.
Of course, the US has no official declaration of military commitments to Taiwan, but the emphasis on ambiguity may save Taiwan from China. The lack of clarity will force China to second-guess America's moves on Taiwan, forcing them to dramatically less likely invade Taiwan. This may be great for all parties involved, since opening China has benefited themselves, Taiwan, and the US, and war would definitely end these benefits. There will be obvious losses on all sides, regardless of the victor. Another downside to an open commitment is that America would need to be extremely militarily ready and make sure they can guarantee this commitment, which is unlikely for a war-weary America, who is pretty ready to leave Afghanistan, regardless of its consequences. I'm sure you can relate, Kyle. And Biden may have misspoke, as he often does, but we virtually have an unofficial commitment to defend Taiwan. Biden was just being honest about it for a moment. Pretty much, Taiwan is safe without the US needing to go to war with China, at least for now.
Listen, my position on this, and you guys know this, I've voiced similar concerns when it comes to NATO. I think this is insanity. See, a lot of people like to, in this conversation, a lot of people like to bring up what happened in World War II. So namely, well, Hitler was being appeased, and you can't appease somebody like Hitler because he was hell-bent on global domination, and he would have done everything by force and taken it over by force. And there were these, treaties that were made with Hitler. And Neville Chamberlain very famously was waving the sheet of paper like, look, we got a peace agreement with Hitler, and so now we've divvied up the land and how it's going to be, and Germany gets this extra territory, but they don't go any further than this, and they thought it was a victory. And then what happened was, it's true, Hitler was unappeasable. Winston Churchill was right in that respect, and so he kept expanding and expanding and expanding, and then eventually we had World War II. And that's the lesson that people are drawing from, is World War II. But it's interesting because nobody ever talks about that World War I actually has the opposite lesson. So if the lesson of World War II is what? Some people are unappeasable. There is no way to have, negotiate peace with them. If they're hell-bent on world domination, they're going to try to do world domination. And Hitler wanted to do it by force. That's the lesson of World War II. The lesson of World War I is actually the opposite, which is if you have these treaties where independent nations are tied into the future of other nations. And so, in other words, if country X is drawn into a war, then country Y has an obligation because of a treaty to also jump into that war on that side. But then country C hops in, and country L has to hop in on the side of country C. And so what happens is, if you have all these mutual defense treaties, well, if people actually abide by them, it doesn't take long for the entire world to be at war. So you get random Archduke Ferdinand gets assassinated in, I think, Austria-Hungary, and the next thing you know, the entire world is at war. That's World War II. That's World War I. Why? Why did that happen? Because everybody had these strategic alliances where, hey, if I go to war, you go to war with me, right? Okay, right. And if they go to war, they go to war with them. And everybody abided by the treaties, and so the entire world was at war. And in that, the takeaway from that World War, the lesson from this one, is the opposite of the lesson of World War I. The takeaway of World War II, excuse me. I can't talk today, and that sucks because I talk for a living. Anyway, so the takeaway from World War I is maybe we shouldn't have strategic alliances with all these other independent nations, because if there happens to be something that happens in one of them, then we get drawn in, then somebody else gets drawn in, then somebody else gets drawn in, and next thing you know, the entire world is at war. Whereas if it was more of like a go-it-alone attempt, a go-it-alone approach, then you would have had a much more compartmentalized and fragmented war on a much smaller scale, which would have been significantly less bloody. So the lesson of World War I was actually non-interventionism is better. Or, the pejorative term people use is isolationism is better.
What Kyle is talking about is how one conflict forced various countries to join each other, one by one, like dominoes, due to their respective alliances, into a much larger war, aka World War I. But there was much more to how the alliance system caused World War I, specifically how it wasn't properly executed. It all begins with Chancellor Otto von Bismarck of Germany. He was trying to create an alliance with Germany, Austria, and Russia, which was called the League of Free Emperors. The idea was that a powerful alliance would keep the peace in Europe, and also isolate Germany's enemy France. However, the alliance was dissolved twice, thanks to Austria and Russia's territorial disputes over Serbia. In particular, Austria was worried that Russian support for Serbia would help embolden the Slavic populations to rebel against Austria. In other words, nationalism, whether Austrian or Slavic, made the purpose of the alliance system unworkable in the first place. As a side effect of Russia leaving the alliance first time around, Italy joined both Germany and Austria, creating the Triple Alliance. Keep this in mind for later. After Russia left the second time, Bismarck tried to rectify this through the Reinsurance Treaty. Sadly, Bismarck was removed from his position, and Kaiser Wilhelm rejected the renewal of the treaty, due to contradictions with other international commitments, and that Wilhelm felt his friendship with the Tsar was enough to deter war. Regardless, this had contributed to Russia moving closer to France, which developed a Franco-Russian alliance. This was so significant that some historians considered the fall of the Reinsurance Treaty one of the causes of World War I. Remember how Germany wanted to isolate France and that Italy joined the Triple Alliance? Well, it appears that at the beginning, it was Germany, Austria, and Russia against France and Europe. This situation seems perfect to deter war due to such an imbalance. But the failure to follow through with the original meant this altered to Austria, Germany, and Italy going up against Russia and France, a more volatile scenario ripe for a war. Add growing Serbian nationalism to raise tensions between Russia and Austria, and it's clear that the domino effect of alliances alone wasn't enough to cause the war. Some would say it was inevitable due to the difficulties developing a proper alliance system and rising nationalism, where the pan-Slavic nationalism I mentioned is just one example. Not to mention other factors, such as militarism, but this video is already too long. We don't have the same levels of ultra-nationalism that would make countries irrationally want war, especially since we have seen those effects with both world wars and our alliance systems aren't as incompetent. This makes the alliance domino effect less likely in the modern day.
So this is why history is fascinating, because it's endlessly complex and nuanced, where in some instances it seems like the right thing is not to be non-interventionist. If you have somebody who's really hell-bent on world domination, you need to ally with the people who want to fight back against that evil force. But on the flip side, if you have something that would just be a regional conflict and you team up and get involved, well, then the whole world could be at war when it could have just been a regional conflict. So in some instances, non-interventionism is vastly preferable, I'd argue in most cases, but because not everybody's Hitler. But in rare instances, interventionism is preferable. So in this instance, where does this one fall? I don't think it's a tough one at all. I think this is a lot more like World War I than World War II.
It's funny how you say history is nuanced, yet you only provide two binary options. What if there was a third option? That China wasn't as bad as Nazi Germany, that Xi Jinping wasn't as bad as Hitler, but that China wouldn't invade Taiwan if America and other allies were to get involved, that China wouldn't want war with multiple other countries unlike Adolf Hitler. Specifically, China shares land borders with 14 other countries, meaning they are vulnerable to open attack on numerous fronts if they try anything. Another argument is wealth. China has significant industrial investments in the US and other allies like Japan and Europe. Xi Jinping doesn't want to fight their moneymakers, further deterring them from war. In addition, mainland China are heavily dependent on energy and goods passing through other US allied nations in what's called the Malacca Strait. Another reason for China not to want war. This dependence on the strategic Malacca Strait is what motivates the Belt and Road Initiative that you mentioned, Kyle.
You know, China currently engaged in the Belt and Road Initiative, which doesn't have anything to do with Taiwan, but it is sort of an expansion of empire through debt, in a sense.
This is a way of expanding their tyranny without conflict, but a tyranny created by peace is in effect the same as a tyranny created by war.
And I think that if you do, let's say for argument's sake, China does something in regards to Taiwan. Do I feel terrible for the people of Taiwan? Yes. But is it something I'd send U.S. soldiers to fight and die for? No. Some random kid in Kentucky probably can't even point out Taiwan on a map, and you want him to go fight and die for Taiwan?
You do realize joining the military is voluntary, right? You may not get to choose the countries or missions you go to, but you can choose whether or not to be a soldier. And that kid will probably understand the Taiwan situation when he's old enough to be a soldier. But to make a less trivial point, Taiwan is the largest semiconductor manufacturer with a 54% global market share, and the US is unable to replicate their production lines along with China. Semiconductors are present in most of our life, ranging from mobile phones to cars and fighter jets. So a complete disruption of semiconductor supply chains caused by China's invasion of Taiwan can lead to an annual fall in $490 billion for electronic producers worldwide. This could create a new black swan event, with a supply chain crisis that is worse than even COVID-19.
Now, again, you can make the argument, well, this is more like World War II, and Xi Jinping is like Hitler, and therefore, we have a moral obligation to go do it. I simply don't agree with you. I don't think Xi Jinping, even though I think Xi Jinping is terrible, I don't think he's Hitler. I don't think almost anybody is like Adolf Hitler.
Not my argument. China isn't Hitler, they don't want war, and will be deterred by the US military, as I said this before.
And people think everything's so settled and secure these days that there wouldn't be a World War III. How the do you know? After World War I, they thought there was going to be no World War II, and then there was World War II. You know, everything's fragile, and cooler heads need to prevail. If I really thought we were in a Hitler-like situation, then my opinion would be the opposite. I don't think we're in a Hitler-like situation.
Because China prefers its economic expansion than military expansion, and has benefited through peaceful globalization. China has a lot to lose economically, as stated before. If you find the reiteration of my points annoying, it is because Kyle likes to repeat his points. Also, many countries after World War I were economically suffering, like Germany and Russia, which set up World War I. But since 1990, extreme world poverty has been dramatically reduced. I did a video on this and you can check it out in the link below.
So as much as I feel terrible for the people of Taiwan, and if they want their own independence, I support them in getting their own independence, but I don't want the US to get involved, and I don't want the US to fight a war on behalf of Taiwan, and if we do that, then it's us versus China, which is World War III, which is then all these other countries get brought in, you know, obviously Europe on our side, and then Russia on China's side, and we're off to the races.
For a guy who whines so much about inequality, he should realize that Taiwan is militarily and economically too small to face China. It is frankly unfair. which is a justification to bring in the US, who is somewhat comparable to China, to help deter an invasion of a small island who did nothing wrong. And I know I sound like a broken record, but China is very unlikely to initiate war, which is why I support an American commitment to Taiwan.
But I think the other thing is, I think Biden, even though he did the right thing on Afghanistan and pulling out, I think he feels like he's overcompensating, because now it's like he's viewed as weak by the deep state and the intelligence agencies and elite media, and so he's trying to be like, I'm not weak, and so he gets asked that question, and he's like, yeah, of course I'd defend Taiwan if something were to happen.
Taiwan is not Afghanistan. Regardless of what you think of the withdrawal or whether we should have left, Taiwan is a thriving democracy with decent living standards and great human rights compared to the rest of the region, while Afghanistan is unstable and too vulnerable to extremist ideologies. You can argue that Afghanistan is not worth saving and won't become a democracy, but Taiwan is worth saving, and a lot was sacrificed to help create democracies like not only Taiwan but Germany, South Korea and others. We cannot let those sacrifices be in vain.
Way too many people think everything is World War II and everyone is Hitler. No, sometimes it's World War I, and we should avoid, hilarious Freudian slip, we should avoid those ends where everybody gets pulled in because of what we view as obligations. So, there you have it, that's my breakdown.
Actually, way too many people believe in simplistic binaries when it comes to foreign policy, rather than actually see any nuance. In the long term, I would like to see less countries be reliant on the US in foreign policy, but for now this won't happen due to powerhouses like China and Russia. Moreover, I admit that due to America's decline, China may eventually not be threatened by America's military, so we may need a new solution to defend Taiwan. I'm going to release my video on Carissa Avalon's debate with my friend Toasted on Trump's tax cuts for next Sunday. And if we schedule this right, then today, Sunday at 2 PM British Standard Time, we will both be on the stream on Mikhail's channel as well as others, which will be linked below, and it's related to the Kyle Rittenhouse case. I had to cut some of Kyle's video for time, but I have linked his video in the description below for context, and I've also added my sources there, which I encourage you to look through. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give a like and comment, as it really helps my video in the YouTube algorithm, and if you like economics and political commentary, consider subscribing. Maybe follow me on my Twitter, and see you later.